The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I approached the Ember Tower, that rusted sentinel nearby the western ridge. Gray steel coils upward, its flaking red paint dulled by decades of storms. I hoisted my pack, heavy with maps, radio, and a thermos of lukewarm coffee, and began my ascent. The air smelled of wet pine needles and dusk's impending chill, and the sun was dragging its dying light behind the hills. Each step up the narrow ladder sent vibrations up my arms, the thin metal groaning beneath my weight. At the top, a cramped wooden cab awaited, windows smeared with forgotten fingerprints and spiderwebs shimmering faintly in the last light. Inside the cab, the rough wooden floor creaked underfoot, and the stale air smelled faintly of smoke and mold. I settled into the stiff chair, the radio static humming low in the background. My eyes scanned the endless forest blanket, the pines now black shadows pooling into one another. I unrolled maps and traced imagined fire lines with a fingertip, the distant calls of birds folding into silence. The wind snapped a slack cable outside, a metallic rattle that echoed like an alarm. I sipped coffee, turning tepid, a sense of quiet purpose settling over me. The tower's narrow windows framed isolation perfectly, no neighbor for miles, only the vast, watchful wilderness. Hours passed in a slow procession of shadows and silence. I caught movement at the tree line, perhaps a deer, but nothing solid enough to claim. The radio crackled briefly, a fragment of distant chatter breaking the quiet, then silence again. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying something faint and indecipherable, like a whispered breath across the needles. A subtle unease twined through me, like a weight pressing beneath ribs. The tower seemed to creak with its own breath, forcing my gaze to snap to each corner, every pane of glass collecting dim reflections of my own tense face. I told myself it was the isolation messing with my mind, but the feeling lingered like a stain. The night deepened, a black velvet over the horizon. Suddenly, a rhythmic tapping, barely audible at first, echoed on the metal frame outside. I froze, each tap measured, deliberate. I traced it to the weathered tower wall, where frost had begun to gather in tiny spiked crystals. The tapping stopped as abruptly as it began, leaving in its place an oppressive silence that filled every crevice. The cab's dim overhead bulb flickered, casting elongated shadows that wavered like twisted fingers crawling the walls. Heart ticking loudly in my ears, I forced my breath to slow, convinced by every fiber it was only the wind, yet doubt clawed relentlessly. Restless and plagued by shadows, I reached for the ancient binoculars, their cold leather grip slick in my clammy hands. Peering through the scratched lenses, the forest stretched endlessly, but something unmarked gnawed at the edges, a shape that slipped just beyond recognition, hiding behind a bent pine or a curtain of fog curling low between the trunks. The moon cast a sickly pale light, imperfect and wavering, as if afraid to reveal the secrets beneath. A sudden crack snapped out, like a branch breaking, or a deliberate signal. My breath caught, fingers tightening their hold, heart thrumming a primal warning. The tower felt less like an observation post, and more like a cage surrounding invisible eyes. A sudden knocking drummed hard against the cab's outer wall, muffled but urgent. I slammed the binoculars down, heart pounding hard enough to drown out the night. The knocking shattered the quiet like stones against glass. But when I flung the door open, the night answered with empty, clawing stillness. Only the cold wind whispered through the pines. I searched the narrow platform wrapping the cab, peering over the edge into black indifference. Not a footprint, not a broken branch. No sign of disturbance except the fading echo of the knocks. The tower suddenly felt impossibly high and terrifyingly exposed, as though whatever was out there was waiting, playing a silent game. Inside again, I bolted the door and settled against the wall, palms slick with cold sweat. The radio shrugged to life, a crackle, then a whisper, a voice crushed by static but unmistakably human. I leaned in, breath hitching as the voice repeated a single word: leave. It was crushed and desperate, a hiss folded into the white noise. I slammed the radio off and scanned the shadows, which now seemed to pulse, as if breathing along with me. The tiny cab felt suffocating, the flickering overhead bulb now dim as twilight, melting into deep night. Somewhere outside, the forest watched, waited. For what, I couldn't say. Trying to push past the creeping dread, I pulled out my small flashlight, its beam trembling against the low ceiling and walls. The interior was suddenly strange, the familiar wood grain now warped by shadows dancing like living things. Somewhere in the corner, an icicle-thin shadow flickered too fast to track, a movement both there and not there. I scrambled to the window, pressing flat against the cold glass, scanning for anyone or anything. The forest was a quiet mouth, closed, impenetrable. But at that moment, a faint breath fogged the glass inches from my face, sharp and cold as a knife's edge. I spun, nothing there but the oppressive dark. In a burst of cold fury, the lights suddenly cut out, the cab falling into utter darkness as the bulb's last flicker died. Panic hammered my chest as I groped for the flashlight, its beam cutting a desperate swath through the black interior. Then, at the far end of the cab, a pair of eyes glistened. Yellow, unblinking, unearthly calm. They didn't blink, didn't shift, just watched. I wanted to scream, but my throat was a desert. The eyes were too high, too large. Something not human staring at me from the corner where no shadow should exist. The air turned viscous, heavy with thick silence that pressed against my skin like cold mud. I stood frozen, every sense screaming run, but rooted to that gaze. Heartbeat echoing in my ears, I forced my eyes wider, trying to pierce the darkness beyond those glowing orbs. The shape beneath was slender and undefined, almost melting into the warped wood paneling. Every breath came shallow, trembling as the eyes slowly edged closer along their strange path, unhurried and deliberate. The faint scent of cold earth and scorched wood crept into the still air, mixing with an unnatural chill that traced the back of my neck. My hands fumbled, gripping the flashlight so tightly the knuckles went white. The creature's gaze held no madness or rage, only a resigned patience, as if we were two unwilling prisoners in the same dwindling light. Suddenly, the wooden floor beneath me vibrated, subtle, then growing stronger, like a heartbeat syncing with mine. The tower seemed to breathe, the metal frame creaking in unnatural pulses that resonated through my bones. Outside, unseen branches raked the cab walls in erratic, scraping beats that set every nerve on edge. The entity's presence expanded with the sound, filling the space with a stillness so thick it almost buried my thoughts. I backed toward the door, every step a scrape and creak, the darkness pressing tighter around me like a living shroud. The cold grew deeper, an invisible frost winding through the cab, as if the forest itself had inhaled and held its breath. I yanked the door, the ancient latch grating as it slid, the platform spilling cold moonlight onto my face. No time to think, darkness clinging tight behind me as I descended the ladder 2 rungs at a time. The air outside bit sharper, pine needles sharp with frost underfoot. A whisper trailed behind, a dry, rustling breath weaving through the silence. I dared a glance upward. The tower's windows flickered faintly, like eyes watching, waiting. A shape detached from shadow, gliding across the platform with unnatural silence, its presence a cold pressure against my spine. Fear burned hot, legs moving on pure instinct, the forest swallowing my frantic scramble into night. The forest floor yielded to brittle branches and thick bramble as I ran blind through the undergrowth. The cold night air stung raw in my throat. The weight of unseen eyes twisted every branch into threatening hands. Behind me, a scrape, a sinister counterpoint to my ragged breathing. I stumbled into a shallow ditch, branches clutching at my clothes, and scrambled up again. The shadow was closer now, a silent tide pressing through the black. Through gaps in the trees, I glimpsed the fire tower standing stark and distant, a beacon turned ominous silhouette against the inked sky. Hope felt thin and brittle, dissolving into the forest's suffocating clutch. Panting, I collided with the edge of a rocky outcrop and instinctively turned, straining for any sign of the shadow. Between the gnarled roots, something gleamed. Not eyes, but a flicker of reflected moonlight off a half-buried object. Crouching, I unearthed an old burnt tinderbox, its charred wood scarred and scarred again like it had survived deliberate fire. The silence pressed closer, broken by a soft rustling in the leaves nearby. I gripped the tinderbox tightly, feeling its weight as a faint pulse. A talisman against the invisible dread, closing in with every careless breath. I crouched, my breath clouding in the frigid air, eyes darting to a sudden snapping twig to my right. There, pressed close to a tree trunk, a shape crouched. Limbs too long, its face shrouded in tangled shadows, but unmistakably watching. It did not move, did not signal aggression, only observed with brittle patience. The fire tower's presence radiated faintly behind it, a stark contrast to the wild creature rooted in the earth. The shape's eyes glinted a dull amber, reflecting distant stars, and an eerie silence filled the space between us. I understood then. It was not a predator, but the forest's watcher, a guardian, or perhaps a prisoner itself, bound forever to Ember Tower's lonely vigil. The creature shifted with a sound like dry leaves, just enough to make my heart stumble. I shrank back into the shadows, the tinderbox cold in my palm. The watcher did not pursue, but the space between us thickened with unspoken dialogue. Behind it, the forest darkened, branches bowing like silent witnesses. As distant clouds slid across the moon, the eyes lost their glow and faded into the night's black fabric. The watcher dissolved, leaving behind a whisper of smoke curling up from the tinderbox. Silence roared again, heavier than before, as if the forest itself exhaled a warning that this was not a place for the living. The forest grew unnervingly still, thick with the weight of absence. I stumbled back toward the tower, the tinderbox pulsing faintly in my grip, a relic from a story older than the trees themselves. Climbing the ladder, the metal was cold and unforgiving beneath shaking hands. Inside, my breath fogged the glass when I peered out. No eyes waited this time, no shape in the corners. Only the silent sea of pines stretching endlessly under a fractured moon. I set the tinderbox carefully on the window ledge, its faint ember casting a fragile halo in the dim cab light. Perhaps some watcher always lingers, as I do now, tethered to this lonely post between shadow and flame. Morning broke slowly, a pale wash of gray spilling across the heavens. I lingered beside the window, tracing frost patterns that embroidered the glass. The tinderbox lay cold now, its ember gone, or so I thought. As the light shifted, a faint inscription etched itself into the wooden frame. Two words scorched into the grain, impossible to miss. You watch. My skin prickled, and the forest stirred outside, whispering leaves, a breath held too long, as if waiting for me to understand. The tower was no longer just my watchpoint. It was a nexus, stitched with unseen eyes woven from shadow and flame, a silent pact bound by the watcher who had never left. I packed my gear slowly, the rhythm hollow against the heavy quiet. Each object felt heavier with the weight of what I'd come to understand. This tower, a sentinel, not just against fire, but against something older, something patient. Outside, the forest breathed steady release, but my shadow lingered too long on the cracked metal stairs. As I took my last look back, the cab windows gleamed faintly like twin lanterns, silent and watching. I stepped down, every crunch of gravel a shattering of the fragile peace the forest grudgingly offered me. The Ember Tower, waiting, was a story without an end, and I was no longer just the watcher, but watched. Days later, back in town, old newspapers and legends whispered of a fire lookout who vanished atop Ember Tower decades ago. Nobody had seen him leave, and when search parties climbed up, they found only faint ashes and a scorched wooden box, its presence inexplicable. Holding the tinderbox now, its blackened edges soft and worn, I realized it was not just a relic, but a vessel of all those who came before, each watching, each waiting in silence. As dusk settled outside my window, I glimpsed a flicker of yellow eyes in the dark reflection, unblinking and patient. The watcher was not gone. It had simply changed posts,